If you were looking for a video complaining about Final Fantasy XVI and calling it a bad game like many of the other ones recently put out there, you've stumbled across the wrong video. But just as well, if you were hoping for a video with nothing but praise for the game, it's not this one. For most people, including myself, Final Fantasy XVI is the definition of mid. No pun intended. Especially given the high standard we're used to from this franchise. It does a lot of things extremely well, but unfortunately what it does poorly often overshadows the good. And today I'll be giving a spoiler-free breakdown of why I think this game is just okay, but also why I think many of you out there might love it. Final Fantasy XVI is a weird blend of the highest highs and lowest lows. Like all the games in this series, the story is absolutely fantastic throughout, and many parts of it will have you literally on the edge of your seat. Square Enix always does an excellent job with its storytelling, and this game is no exception. The main character, Clive, voiced by Ben Starr, is about as good as they come for a Final Fantasy protagonist. The portrayal of his hard life and personal struggles are sure to make even the toughest players feel emotional. And the music is about as perfect as it can be, which really elevates all of the feelings. I would even go as far as to say that this is one of the most well-told Final Fantasy stories, and the developers and writers should really be commended for this. The biggest problem I faced with the game were the parts in between the main story. Final Fantasy XVI is a prime example of the destination being great, but the journey to get there often being tedious. Since Final Fantasy games are RPGs for the most part, there are always going to be a lot of side quests and activities that could potentially double the length of the game. Unfortunately, this is where Final Fantasy XVI struggles the most, as I would say the side quests aren't just bad, they're downright lazy. Now to be fair, they are just side quests and completely optional. However, some of them can give you crucial items, like a chocobo, that make your experience with the rest of the game much better. On top of this, Final Fantasy has always previously done a great job of tucking side quests away and making you feel like you didn't really miss anything if you choose not to do them. Whereas in Final Fantasy XVI, the game is constantly reminding you about them. If you're like me, this little change will make you miserably drag yourself through them all, which in my opinion actually greatly takes away from the experience. I always say quality over quantity, and Final Fantasy XVI really struggles to find that balance. Now once again, when it comes to the highs and lows, Final Fantasy XVI is both one of the best looking PS5 games and simultaneously one of the worst looking PS5 games. I have always hated when games have different styles of cutscenes showing the story. I understand that the big pre-rendered ones take a lot of time and effort to make, and they signify an important part of the story. However, there is such a big shift between the two in this game. Those pre-rendered cutscenes genuinely look like a big budget movie. I would honestly watch them even without playing the game. However, the in-game rendered cutscenes look quite awful, with the voice-to-mouth movements being reminiscent of an old Bethesda game.
Stop right there, criminal scum! Nobody breaks the law on my watch!
I feel like the visuals are really lacking polish in a lot of areas, which is so confusing and frustrating given the massive budget Square Enix has when creating Final Fantasy games. I'm not sure if this was just due to a time constraint or what, but it is quite jarring when playing the game. Especially considering how good games like Final Fantasy XIII looked the whole way through, even being released almost 15 years ago. With all of that said, the icon battles are absolutely epic and visually stunning. Aside from a few frame drops, they are probably the best looking combat scenes we have seen on the PS5 thus far. Like a lot of battles in the game, they are full of vibrant colors, amazing lighting, and some of the absolute best action. So if you only care about graphics in a game, a lot of the parts here will have you pretty blown away. Unfortunately, it's just not consistent. Now speaking of action and combat, Final Fantasy XVI has a full action combat system, rather than turn-based, which the franchise has always previously been known for. Aside from a few gripes which I will mention, I really enjoy the combat in this game. While I do personally prefer turn-based combat, or that perfect hybrid from Final Fantasy VII Remake, the combat was one of the visual high points. It is fast-paced, flashy, and adrenaline-fueled. The system is somewhat deep and takes a bit of time to master. However, it's easy to get into as button mashing and dodging at the right times will get you pretty far. Now my issues with the combat system may just pertain to me being a big Soulsborne combat fan, but I feel like the game's combat system would greatly be improved by increasing your damage output and the consequences of being hit. Oftentimes, I would finish a 5 to 10 minute battle with almost no damage taken and an extremely sore thumb from attacking over and over again. And this was on the game's middle action difficulty. While increasing the difficulty would lead to more damage taken, it would also result in the enemies being even more spongy, and honestly, I don't know if my thumb or my controller could take that. With all things considered, I do think a majority of players who are new to the franchise would prefer this style of combat over turn-based. However, a lot of longtime fans like myself won't. On that note, you've probably heard a lot of people say something along the lines of, Final Fantasy XVI is a good game, just not a good Final Fantasy game. And while I hate to echo that already overused narrative, it is truly how I feel about this game, and here's why. Final Fantasy games have always been known for a few core staples: turn-based-ish combat, party battles often involving a job system and controlling multiple characters at once, being able to use summonings really anytime in battle, and for the most part, those things aren't in Final Fantasy XVI, or at least they're done in a very different way. To me, Final Fantasy XVI feels like a game created by BioWare rather than Square Enix. It is trying so hard to be larger than life when Final Fantasy games tend to shine the most while being somewhat linear. And I'm not ripping on BioWare here, a lot of people out there would prefer games like that, but there are a lot of people who kind of hate it. I think if you've ever tried getting into this series and you found yourself not really enjoying it, it's a good idea to try Final Fantasy XVI, as you might find yourself loving the game. However, if you are a big fan of the franchise and you're hoping for a game that hits the heights of Final Fantasy VII Remake, you'll likely be pretty disappointed here. So to conclude this video, I think Final Fantasy XVI is worth playing if you get the chance to borrow a copy from a friend or even purchase a cheap used copy. But if you are a longtime fan of the franchise, I personally wouldn't recommend it at full price, just because of the inconsistency throughout the game and the lack of feeling like a Final Fantasy title. It's even kind of hard for me to recommend the demo, because the demo was so good that it gives a false impression of the rest of the game. The first few hours of the game are amazing, and it's a prime example of those high points I keep mentioning, and in the demo that's all you see, so that'll likely make you think the game is actually better than it is. Now there is DLC that did just come out for the game, and there's more planned for later this year, and I can't speak on either of those because I'm yet to play the DLC. However, if your main concern is having enough content to keep you busy, you will definitely get that from this game. Whether it's good content or not is up to you to decide. Once again, if you have played other Final Fantasy games in the past and have not enjoyed them, this might just be the one for you because it is quite different from all the others. But for the vast majority of people, I would recommend just waiting for 7 Rebirth, considering how good 7 Remake was, and also considering it will be the same price if purchased in a retail store. If I had to give it a score out of 10, Final Fantasy XVI gets a 7.5 for me. And it's one of the few games that I feel would greatly benefit from having less content. If there were less side quests and more of a focus on making all of the in-game cutscenes actually decent, I could see myself giving this game an 8. But as it currently stands, there are just too many negatives for me to comfortably do that. However, if your only goal is to see an excellent story, you will get it here. In fact, the best way to experience this game might just be watching all of the pre-rendered cutscenes here on YouTube. That way you don't have to deal with everything in between. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this video from a big Final Fantasy fan helped you with your buying decisions. If it did, please like, comment, and subscribe, and consider becoming a channel member if you really want to support. As always, take care guys, and I will see you in the next one.